Imagine leaving everything behind. Your family, your land, your past. Now imagine doing this for a king, for an empire, and for a future you cannot even picture. It is 1663, and the tiny settlement of Quebec in New France is hanging by a thread. For every woman in the colony there are 10 men, 10 to 1, hunters, soldiers, farmers, all tough as nails, but aching with loneliness. Letters flood back to King Louis XIV. Men quarrel over the few women who remain. Morale is collapsing, and many settlers are packing their few belongings and heading back across the Atlantic. Without families, Quebec feels like a trading post with no roots, easy to abandon when winter snows cut off all supply ships or when tensions with local peoples flare into violence. Louis XIV, the Sun King who built Versailles and dreamed of a French empire spanning continents, decides on a solution as bold as it is simple. He will send women. Not noble ladies seeking adventure, but 800 daughters of the king, chosen from orphanages, poorhouses, and crowded convents in villages and towns across France. These are women with nowhere else to turn, orphans who have outgrown the charity of a convent, young widows left with debt and no dowry, poor girls for whom the promise of a new life feels like a miracle. They sign a contract that seems almost too generous to be true: free passage across the ocean, a small dowry to start a household, the promise of land and tools, and most urgent of all, they must marry within 6 months of landing. 6 months to find not just a husband, but a partner who can help them survive a winter that can kill with a single frost. The voyage itself is an ordeal of wind-tossed seas and cramped quarters. Few ships leave France without illness sweeping through their ranks. Yet these women endure, driven by the hope that a stranger's hand will be gentler than the life they leave behind. When they step onto the wooden docks of Quebec City, salt in their hair and fear in their hearts, they hold more than suitcases and dowries. They carry the fragile future of an entire colony. This was not charity. It was a radical social experiment. The Sun King was betting that hope and partnership could build a lasting empire where armies and treaties had failed. And as these 800 women looked into the faces of anxious settlers, both sides must have wondered, can marriage conquer a wilderness? Can love win against snow and wolves? History would give its answer in the next decade, but in that moment everything hung on a choice to leave certainty behind and step into the unknown. Picture this. It's 1663, and New France is hanging by a thread. Quebec, this tiny outpost carved out of the Canadian wilderness, has a massive problem that's keeping King Louis XIV awake at night. For every woman in the colony, there are 10 men, 10 to 1. You can imagine the chaos. These weren't just numbers on a page for some bureaucrat in Versailles. This was an empire's nightmare. Without families, without children, without roots, Quebec was essentially a glorified trading post that could vanish with the next harsh winter or indigenous conflict. The men were trappers, soldiers, farmers, tough as nails, sure, but what good is conquering territory if you can't hold it? And you can't hold territory without people being born there, growing up there, calling it home. The situation was getting desperate. Reports were flooding back to France describing a colony where loneliness was as common as snow. Men were fighting over the few available women, morale was plummeting, and many colonists were simply giving up and sailing back to France. The dream of a vast French empire in North America was crumbling because of basic human nature. People need companions, they need families, they need hope for the future. Now, King Louis wasn't just any king. This was the Sun King, the guy who built Versailles, who believed France should dominate Europe and beyond. He wasn't about to let his North American ambitions die because of a gender imbalance. But the solution he came up with? It was so radical, so unprecedented, that it sounds almost unbelievable today. Instead of sending more soldiers or building more forts, Louis decided to send women. Not just any women, but 800 of them, specifically recruited for one purpose: to marry the colonists and create the families that would secure New France forever. It sounds simple, maybe even obvious, but think about what this meant. The King of France was essentially playing matchmaker on a continental scale. But here's where it gets really interesting and a bit heartbreaking. Who are these women going to be? Where do you find 800 women willing to leave everything they know for a frozen wilderness on the other side of the world? The answer reveals just how desperate both the empire and these women truly were. The recruitment didn't happen in the palaces of Versailles or among the merchant families of Paris. It happened in the orphanages, the poorhouses, the streets where widows struggled to survive. These weren't adventurous noblewomen seeking excitement. These were women with nowhere else to go. Women for whom even the terrifying unknown of New France looked better than their current reality. Some were orphans who'd aged out of institutions with no family to support them. Others were young widows whose husbands had died in France's endless wars, leaving them with nothing but debt. Many were simply poor, desperately poor, living on the margins of society where one bad harvest or harsh winter could mean death. So when royal recruiters showed up offering free passage to the New World, a dowry to help them start married life, and the promise of land and opportunity, it must have felt like a miracle. But was it really salvation? Or were they trading one kind of desperation for another? Were they brave adventurers seizing their chance at a better life? Or were they pawns in a political game bigger than any of them could imagine? The truth, like most truths, was probably somewhere in between. And that's what makes their story so compelling, because these 800 women were about to become something nobody expected. The founding mothers of an entire nation. Meet Marie. She's 17, an orphan from a convent in Rouen. Her parents died when she was 8, and she spent nearly a decade learning to read, write, and embroider, skills that were supposed to help her find work as a governess or seamstress, but jobs are scarce, and the convent can't support her forever. Then there's Jeanne, 23, and already a widow. Her husband died in one of Louis XIV's many wars, leaving her with debts she can't pay, and a future that looks increasingly bleak. She's been working as a servant, but even that barely keeps her fed. And Marguerite, 19, whose family lost their small farm to bad harvests. She's been living on the streets of Paris, doing whatever she can to survive. When the recruiters find her, she's thin, desperate, and running out of options. These were the women who became the king's daughters. Marie, Jeanne, Marguerite, common names that history almost forgot, but extraordinary destinies that shaped an entire nation. They weren't queens or duchesses. They were the forgotten women of France, the ones society had left behind. The contract they signed seems almost too good to be true. Free passage across the Atlantic, a dowry of 50 livres. That's about a year's wages for a working woman, and the promise of finding a husband within 6 months of arriving in Quebec. The government would even provide basic household items to help them start their new lives. But think about what they were really signing up for. A 2-month voyage across the Atlantic in a wooden ship where disease could kill you before you ever saw land. Then arrival in a place where winter temperatures could drop to 30 below zero, where the nearest neighbor might be miles away, and where the sound of wolves howling at night was just part of everyday life. The 6-month deadline wasn't just bureaucratic efficiency, it was survival. Winter in Quebec was brutal, and unmarried women had almost no chance of making it through alone. They needed husbands not just for companionship, but for protection, for shelter, for the basic necessities of staying alive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But here's what makes their story even more remarkable. They had choices. When these women arrived in Quebec, they weren't just handed over to the first man who wanted them. They could interview potential husbands, ask about their land, their plans, their character. They could say no. In an age when most women had no say in their marriages, the king's daughters had more freedom than many noble women back in France. And they used it. Records show that some women rejected multiple suitors before finding the right match. Others broke off engagements when they discovered their fiancés weren't what they seemed. A few even returned to France rather than settle for a marriage that felt wrong. Here's something that might surprise you. Some of these women actually ran away from abusive fiancés, and the French government backed them up. If a king's daughter complained that her intended husband was cruel or violent, the authorities would investigate. Men who mistreated these women could be fined, imprisoned, or even banned from marrying any of the king's daughters. This was almost unheard of in the 17th century, a time when women, especially poor women, had virtually no legal protection from male violence. But the real challenge wasn't finding a husband, it was surviving everything that came after. The Canadian winter that could freeze your breath in your lungs, diseases like scurvy and typhus that swept through the colonies, the isolation of living in a place where your nearest neighbor might be a day's journey away, and where the sound of your own voice might be the only human sound you hear for weeks. Imagine being Marie, 19 years old, married to a farmer she's known for 3 weeks, pregnant with her first child, and facing her first Canadian winter. The temperature outside is 20 below zero, the wind is howling through the gaps in your log cabin walls, and you're wondering if you'll live to see spring. That's not just survival, that's heroism. These women didn't just endure, they thrived. They raised children, built communities, and created the foundation for what would become French Canada. But their names? Marie, Jeanne, Marguerite? They're barely remembered today, even though their courage changed the course of history. When these women stepped off the ships in Quebec City, something revolutionary happened. Something that would have been unthinkable back in France. They were given choices. Picture the scene. Marie steps onto the wooden dock, salt spray still in her hair, looking around at this rough frontier town that's supposed to be her new home. Within days, men start approaching her. Not just any men, potential husbands. But here's the thing that would have shocked anyone back in Paris. She gets to interview them. That's right. These women, many of whom had never had any say in their own lives, suddenly found themselves in the position of choosing their own futures. They could ask questions. How much land do you own? What are your plans for farming? Do you have a house built? Or will we be living in a tent through winter? Have you been married before? Why did your last wife leave? And if they didn't like the answers, they could walk away. Just like that. Imagine being 20-year-old Jeanne, sitting across from a gruff fur trapper, who's promising her riches from beaver pelts but can't look her in the eye. She can say no. She can wait for someone better. In an age when most marriages were arranged by fathers and families, these women had more freedom than duchesses. Some took full advantage of it. Records show women who rejected 5, 6, even 7 suitors before finding the right match. Others broke off engagements when they discovered their fiancés had been lying about their circumstances. A few decided the whole thing was a mistake and actually sailed back to France. But most stayed, and most found someone. The matchmaking worked so well, it was almost magical. Men who had been alone for years suddenly had wives. Women who had faced destitution in France suddenly had homes, land, and the promise of a future. The results were incredible. In just 10 years, Quebec's population doubled, not through immigration but through births. Families were being created at a rate that must have made King Louis smile all the way back in Versailles. His grand experiment was working. But let's be honest about the price they paid. This wasn't some fairy tale where everyone lived happily ever after. Childbirth in 17th-century Quebec was dangerous under the best circumstances. Add in the harsh climate, limited medical care, and the stress of frontier life, and it became deadly. Many of these women died giving birth to the children who would populate New France. They sacrificed their lives for the next generation, often dying far from any family who might have mourned them. Others simply vanished. The Canadian wilderness was vast and unforgiving. Some women, overwhelmed by the isolation or trapped in terrible marriages, walked into the forest and were never seen again. Did they die of exposure? Were they taken in by indigenous communities? Did they somehow make their way to other settlements? We'll never know. They became part of the mystery of the untamed land. Then there were the diseases, smallpox, typhus, scurvy, killers that swept through the colonies regularly. Many kings' daughters survived the ocean crossing, and their first winter only to die in an epidemic 2 or 3 years later. Yet for every tragedy, there were multiple success stories. Women who not only survived, but flourished, who raised large families, became pillars of their communities, and lived to see their grandchildren playing in the same towns where they had once been strangers. The genetic impact of this experiment is mind-blowing. Today, researchers estimate that 2/3 of French Canadians can trace their ancestry back to these 800 women. Think about that. In a population of millions, the genetic heritage flows back to this one group of brave women who crossed an ocean in wooden ships. And here's something that might blow your mind. Celine Dion, one of the most famous singers in the world, descends from one of these kings' daughters. Her ancestor was likely a young woman who stood on that same Quebec dock, probably scared and homesick, making the choice that would eventually lead to one of the most recognizable voices on the planet. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What would you have done? Would you have had the courage to leave everything you knew for a completely unknown future? Would you have been able to make a new life in a place where winter lasted 6 months and your nearest neighbor might be miles away? These women didn't just participate in history, they created it. Their choices, their sacrifices, their incredible resilience turned a struggling outpost into the foundation of a nation. They proved that sometimes the most unlikely people, given the chance, can accomplish the most extraordinary things. Here's something that will give you chills. Walk through Montreal today, Sit in a cafe in Quebec City, attend a hockey game anywhere in French Canada, and look around you. 65% of the people you see carry the DNA of those 800 women who stepped off ships in 1663. That's not just a statistic, that's a miracle of human persistence. Think about it this way. Marie, the 17-year-old orphan we met earlier, might have had 6 children who survived to adulthood. Each of those children had 4 or 5 children of their own. Fast forward 3.5 centuries, and Marie's bloodline could include thousands of descendants. Multiply that by 800 women, and you start to understand how profound their impact really was. If you've ever met someone with the last name Tremblay, there's a good chance they're descended from one of these king's daughters. Same goes for Gagnon, Bouchard, Roy, or dozens of other French-Canadian surnames. These aren't just names, they're living connections to those brave women who chose an unknown future over certain poverty. The politicians who've shaped Canada, many of them carry this DNA. The artists who've defined Quebec culture, the same heritage flows through their veins. The hockey players who've become national heroes, they might be great-great-great-grandchildren of a woman who once stood on a dock in Quebec City, wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. But here's what makes this legacy even more remarkable. It's not just about numbers, it's about identity. These women didn't just populate New France, they created its soul. Every time a French-Canadian family gathers for Sunday dinner, speaking French around a table laden with tourtière and sugar pie, they're living the dream those 800 women dared to dream. Every time someone in Quebec says, "Je me souviens," I remember, they're remembering, whether they know it or not, the courage of women who chose to remember their roots while building something entirely new. The genetic research is fascinating, but it's also deeply personal. Scientists can trace specific mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down through the maternal line, directly back to individual king's daughters. That means somewhere in Quebec, there's a grandmother making maple syrup whose cellular DNA is identical in key ways to a young woman who died 3 centuries ago, possibly in childbirth, possibly of disease, but who lived long enough to ensure her genetic legacy would survive. And it's not just French Canada. These women's descendants spread across North America. Some moved to New England, others to the American Midwest. There are probably people in Louisiana, Minnesota, and Maine who have no idea they're connected to this incredible story. But perhaps the most profound legacy isn't written in DNA at all. It's written in the lesson these women taught the world. You don't build a lasting civilization with conquest alone. You don't create a nation just by planting flags and building forts. You build it with families. You build it with women willing to risk everything for the chance to create something better for their children. The military historians will tell you about the battles that secured New France. The political historians will talk about the treaties and trade agreements. But the real story, the one that explains why French culture didn't just survive but thrived in North America, starts with 800 women who understood something the generals and diplomats missed. The future belongs to those who dare to create it. King Louis XIV thought he was solving a population problem. What he actually did was prove that sometimes the most powerful force in history isn't an army or an empire. It's a mother's determination to build a better world for her children. These women showed that colonies aren't built with soldiers alone. They're built with mothers who teach their children to speak French when everyone around them speaks English. They're built with grandmothers who pass down recipes and stories and songs. They're built with women who plant gardens and raise families and create communities that last for centuries. The king's daughters became the founding mothers of a nation, but more than that, they became proof that ordinary people, given extraordinary circumstances, can change the world. Their legacy isn't just in the DNA of millions of French Canadians, it's in the idea that courage and hope, planted in the right soil, can grow into something beautiful that lasts forever. They were called the king's daughters, but the truth is they were daughters of courage, 800 women who looked at impossible odds and said yes anyway, who chose the unknown over the unbearable, who traded everything familiar for the chance at something better. Their story reminds us of something we often forget when we read about empires and conquests and grand political schemes. Behind every great moment in history, there are ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Not kings or generals or famous explorers, but people like Marie, the orphan who chose marriage to a stranger over a life of poverty. Like Jeanne, the widow who chose the Canadian wilderness over the streets of Paris, like Marguerite, who chose hope over despair. These women didn't set out to change history. They just wanted to survive, to build families, to create something lasting in a world that had given them very little. But in doing so, they became the foundation of a nation. They proved that sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't military might or political strategy. It's the quiet determination of people who refuse to give up. Their legacy lives on in millions of descendants who carry their DNA, their surnames, their unbreakable spirit. But it lives on in something else too, the reminder that each of us has the power to make choices that echo through generations. That ordinary courage, multiplied across hundreds of individual decisions, can literally change the world. So here's the question their story leaves us with. What would you be willing to sacrifice for a better future? What unknown territory would you be brave enough to explore? What impossible dream would you be willing to chase, even if it meant leaving everything familiar behind? The king's daughters didn't know they were making history when they stepped onto those ships in French harbors. They just knew they were choosing possibility over certainty, hope over despair. And in doing so, they remind us that history isn't made by the famous or the powerful alone. It's made by anyone brave enough to take that first step into the unknown. Their courage echoes across the centuries, challenging each of us to ask, when our moment comes, when we're faced with our own impossible choice between the familiar and the transformative, will we have the strength to follow their example? Will we dare to become the ancestors future generations will thank? Because that's the real lesson of the king's daughters. History isn't something that happens to us, it's something we create, one brave decision at a time. If you enjoyed uncovering this incredible story, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves hidden history, and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more epic tales from the past that shaped our world. Until next time, remember, history is made by those who dare to make it.